Rain battered the glass like frantic fingers, blurring the fading world outside. Eleanor Wentworth pressed her forehead to the cold window pane, heart galloping with a wildness that the wind itself might envy. In the garden below, the ancient yew trees swayed, their roots clinging stubbornly to the sodden earth, much like the last vestiges of the Wentworth family's pride. Behind her, the parlor throbbed with the stifling pulse of duty and disappointment. Eleanor could hear her mother's voice sharp, expectant echoing through the hallways, interlaced with the careful rustle of silk, as Margaret glided from room to room, a ghost in blue muslin. Every day in this grand yet fading house seemed to demand something Eleanor could not give. "Eleanor, come away from that window," Lady Wentworth called, her tone edged with exasperation. "You will catch your death, and what use would that be to anyone?" Eleanor turned, her chestnut curls tumbling over her shoulders, her cheeks flushed with the indignation of youth. "I should rather catch my death than spend another moment embroidering handkerchiefs for gentlemen who scarcely know my name," she muttered. Lady Wentworth's eyes narrowed. "You will do as you are told. Margaret, darling, fetch your shawl. The Ashburys are arriving at any moment, and I will not have you looking wan." Margaret obeyed, her movements meek and practiced, her smile small and perfect. Eleanor envied her not. She would rather be bold and alone than cherished for her silence. The arrival of Viscount Edward Ashbury was heralded by the clatter of hooves and the barked commands of a well-trained coachman. Eleanor watched from behind the heavy damask curtains as he stepped from the carriage, tall and straight in his dark coat, a figure carved from the gloom. There was an air of restraint about him, as though he carried invisible armor about his heart. The drawing-room was stifling, perfumed with wilting roses and expectation. Lady Wentworth fluttered like a nervous bird, guiding Margaret to sit by the fire, arranging her curls and smoothing her skirt with anxious hands. Eleanor took her place in the shadows, her mind a battlefield of longing and resentment. Why must Margaret always be the chosen one? Why must Eleanor's laughter be a cause for concern, her opinions a source of dismay? The Viscount entered, his gaze sweeping the room. He nodded to Lady Wentworth, then to Margaret, whose cheeks blushed prettily beneath his attention. "Lady Wentworth, thank you for your invitation," he said, his voice low, each word carefully weighed. "It is a pleasure to meet your family at last." "The pleasure is ours, my lord," Lady Wentworth replied, her smile brittle. "May I present my daughters, Margaret and Eleanor?" Margaret dipped her head, eyes lowered demurely. Eleanor, however, met his gaze with an open defiance that startled even herself. Edward's mouth quirked almost imperceptibly. "Miss Eleanor, I believe I have seen you riding across the moors." "You may have, my lord," Eleanor replied. "I do not much care for staying indoors." Lady Wentworth shot her a warning glance. "Eleanor is spirited," she said, as though it were an apology. Margaret's voice was soft, a balm to the air. "My sister loves the outdoors. She knows every path and stream for miles." "Indeed." Edward's eyes lingered on Eleanor, curiosity flickering in their depths. Eleanor shrugged. "It is better than needlework." The conversation faltered, and Lady Wentworth hurried to fill the silence. "Margaret is quite accomplished at the pianoforte, my lord. Would you care to hear her play?" Edward inclined his head. "I should be delighted." Margaret took her place at the instrument, her fingers gliding over the keys with practiced grace. The music filled the room, delicate and precise, while Eleanor drifted toward the window once more, her silhouette outlined by the fading light. As the final notes faded, Lady Wentworth applauded. "Such talent. Eleanor, will you not join us?" Eleanor shook her head, her gaze fixed on the horizon beyond the rain-lashed glass. In that moment, she felt the walls of the house close in tighter, the weight of expectation pressing her breathless. Margaret shone beneath their mother's gaze, obedient and beloved, while Eleanor stood apart, wild, untamed, and alone. Later, as the guests' laughter echoed through the hallways, and Lady Wentworth whispered her fervent hopes into Margaret's ear, Eleanor lingered on the threshold. She watched the Viscount from afar, noting the way his eyes occasionally sought hers, as though he too sensed the storm that raged just beyond the reach of polite society. And in the quiet that followed, Eleanor knew the night had changed something, though whether it was for better or worse, she could not yet say. The rain continued to fall, relentless and unyielding, as if determined to wash away the old world and make way for the new. Candles flickered along the length of the Wentworth dining table, casting golden halos on the polished silver and fine, if faded, china. The scents of roasted pheasant and stewed pears mingled with the sharper aroma of anticipation that hung in the air. Lady Wentworth sat at the table's head, eyes alight with purpose as she watched the scene unfold, her gaze darting from the Viscount to Margaret, as though she might will their connection into existence. Edward Ashbury, Viscount of Ashbury, was the picture of noble composure as he sat beside Margaret, conversing politely. Margaret, for her part, replied with the gentle courtesy her mother prized above all things, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her voice barely more than a silvery whisper. "Do you find the countryside agreeable, my lord?" she asked, blue eyes lowered demurely. Edward smiled with polite warmth. "Indeed, Miss Wentworth, there is a tranquility here I seldom encounter in London. Your home is most charming." Lady Wentworth beamed. "We are blessed with a rich heritage, my lord. Margaret is well acquainted with all the best walks and vistas. Perhaps you might allow her to show you the lake on a finer day." Margaret blushed, nodding shyly. "It would be a pleasure, my lord." Eleanor, seated across from the pair, felt the words press against her ribs like stones. She stabbed at her food, silent and simmering. If Margaret was a melody, smooth and expected, Eleanor was the discordant note, the uninvited guest at her own family's table. Edward's attention, however dutifully directed toward Margaret, often strayed. He caught glimpses of Eleanor's restless fingers, her stormy eyes. When Eleanor did speak, her words were swift and sharp, cutting through the syrupy pleasantries. "I expect you find our countryside dull, my lord," she interjected, voice edged with challenge. "Unless one enjoys endless talk of weather and cattle." Lady Wentworth's smile froze. "Eleanor, that is uncalled for." But Edward did not recoil. "On the contrary, Miss Eleanor, I find unpredictability quite refreshing. It is rare to encounter such candor." Eleanor's lips curled into a half-smile. "Then you must be the exception, my lord. Most people prefer their country girls meek and agreeable." Lady Wentworth moved swiftly to redirect the conversation, nudging Margaret to speak of her embroidery, her charity work, her gentle devotion to all things proper. The dance continued, a careful orchestration in which Eleanor was always out of step. When the meal ended, Lady Wentworth drew Edward and Margaret into the parlor with a determined air. She left Eleanor behind with a pointed glance, a silent command to remain invisible. The parlor doors closed, muffling the sounds of forced laughter and the clink of teacups. Eleanor could bear it no longer. Her chest felt tight, her skin prickled with the sting of exclusion. She slipped from the house, her boots crunching over the gravel, and vanished into the sheltering embrace of the woods. The air outside was cool and damp, thick with the scent of moss and leaf mold. Here, among the ancient oaks, Eleanor could breathe. She wandered deeper, the sounds of the house receding until only the rush of the wind remained. The trees closed around her, branches reaching out as though to shield her from the world's demands. She paused by a fallen log, sitting, knees drawn to her chest. For a moment she simply listened to the creak of wood, the murmur of a distant stream, the heartbeat of the wild country she loved more fiercely than she could ever love a drawing room. A twig snapped. Eleanor spun, startled. Edward Ashbury stepped into the clearing, a shadow among the trees. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. "My apologies," he said quietly. "I did not mean to intrude." Eleanor straightened, her defiance returning. "You are not intruding. This part of the woods belongs to no one." Edward hesitated, his gaze troubled. "I needed air as well." "Your mother is most attentive, but I find I am not suited to parlor games." Eleanor's laugh was sharp, but not unkind. "Nor am I. You see the result." He moved closer, but kept a respectful distance, hands clasped behind his back. "May I sit?" She nodded, and he lowered himself onto the mossy log beside her. For a while, they sat in companionable silence, the only sound the hush of wind in the trees. Finally, Edward spoke. "You seem to chafe at society's expectations." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "I abhor them. All my life I have been told to be less loud, less opinionated, less myself. But I cannot. I will not. He watched her, the faintest trace of a smile at the corner of his mouth. You are fortunate in a way. I often envy those who can speak so freely. My own life has been a series of obligations, birthright, duty, appearances. Sometimes I hardly know where I end and the Viscount begins. Eleanor studied him, her anger softening. Does it not exhaust you? The pretending? Edward looked away, a muscle ticking in his jaw. It does, but I do not know how to cast it off. There are responsibilities I cannot ignore, people who depend upon me. She drew her knees tighter, her voice gentler. I understand duty, but sometimes I wish I could run until I reach the sea and never look back. Edward's eyes found hers in the dim light. And if you did? She smiled, wistful. I suppose they would send Margaret to fetch me, and she would do it, because she is good and kind and does not wish to disappoint anyone. They both laughed softly, a shared secret in the dark. The moon broke through the branches, painting silver patterns on their faces. Edward's gaze lingered on Eleanor, surprised by the rawness in her eyes, the honesty that seemed to burn through her. He had come expecting to admire Margaret's grace, her serene beauty. And yet, here, in the hush of the woods, it was Eleanor's wildness that drew him, her untamed heart, her refusal to yield. But he remembered Lady Wentworth's intent gaze, the expectation that pressed upon him as heavily as his own coat. He remembered Margaret's gentle smile, the promise of a life uncomplicated by passion or discord. He rose, brushing moss from his trousers. We should return. Your absence will be noted. Eleanor stood as well, her posture straight but her eyes uncertain. You need not explain yourself to me, my lord. Edward hesitated, then bowed his head. You are unlike anyone I have ever met, Miss Eleanor. She met his gaze, searching for the meaning behind his words. And you, my lord, are not quite as you appear. For a moment, the air pulsed with words unsaid, possibilities untouched. Then Edward stepped back, the distance between them growing as he turned toward the house. Eleanor watched him go, feeling the ache of something beginning and ending all at once. When she returned, Margaret was playing a soft melody on the pianoforte, Lady Wentworth hovering nearby, hope shining in her eyes. Edward entered soon after, his composure restored, his smile for Margaret gentle and determined. Eleanor slipped into the shadows, her heart pounding with the force of the woods still within her. She saw, with a pang, how Edward turned to Margaret, how he listened with apparent interest as she spoke of her garden, her hopes for the coming spring. Lady Wentworth's eyes glistened with triumph. But Eleanor knew what had passed in the woods could not be undone. Something unspoken now tied her fate to the Viscount, no matter how tightly he clung to what was proper. As the night drew to a close and the house settled into uneasy silence, Eleanor stood at her window, watching the moon silver the garden. She wondered if anyone else could sense the change in the air, the trembling possibility of all that might still come. Summer ripened across the fields of Wentworth Manor, gilding the hedgerows with wild roses and filling the air with the low hum of bees. Yet inside the stately house, the mood grew ever more taut, each day strung tighter by expectation and unspoken longing. Margaret and Edward were often seen together now, walking beneath the lime trees, sharing polite conversation over tea, sitting side by side in the drawing room as Margaret embroidered and Edward leafed through a book. Their words fell between them like well-rehearsed lines, gentle and unremarkable. The gardens are quite lovely, are they not, my lord? Margaret asked one afternoon, her voice as soft as the petals she gathered in her lap. Edward smiled, though his eyes drifted elsewhere. Indeed, Miss Margaret, you have a rare talent for nurturing beauty. She glanced away, cheeks tinged with pink. You are kind, my lord. I hope your stay in our village has not been too tedious. Not at all, he replied, but his voice lacked conviction. Across the room, Eleanor perched on the window seat, pretending to read, but her eyes betrayed her. She watched their exchanges with a gnawing ache she could neither name nor dispel. Each stilted conversation, each measured smile, fanned a restless fire inside her chest. Rumors spread like wildfire through the village. At the grocer's, in the church pews, along the muddy lanes, tongues wagged with certainty. The Viscount was to wed the younger Miss Wentworth. The match, everyone agreed, was ideal. Margaret's gentle manners perfectly suited to the quiet dignity of the Ashbury name. Eleanor heard the whispers wherever she went. She heard them in the hurried curtsies of shopgirls, the knowing glances exchanged by matrons at the market. Even the vicar's wife, meeting Eleanor in the lane, had smiled with a conspiratorial air. "I suppose you will soon have a wedding to prepare, Miss Wentworth," she had said, her meaning unmistakable. At home, Lady Wentworth's vigilance became relentless. She hovered over Margaret, orchestrating encounters, correcting posture, dictating every word and gesture. "Sit up, Margaret. Do not fidget. Remember to smile, but not too broadly. You must appear modest, not insipid," Lady Wentworth intoned, adjusting her daughter's hair for the third time that morning. Margaret bore it with silent endurance, her hands trembling only slightly as she folded another letter to Edward Letters, full of polite gratitude and safe observations about the weather and the garden. Meanwhile, Eleanor's days grew lonelier. She wandered the fields, climbed the old stone wall by the river, escaped to the woods whenever she could. But even the solace of nature could not still her heart. The memory of her conversation with Edward in the forest haunted her, a secret melody she could not silence. One evening, as the family gathered for supper, Lady Wentworth's patience snapped. "Eleanor, must you always come in with your boots muddy and your hair in such disarray? What will people think?" her mother demanded, voice sharp as a whip. Eleanor met her gaze, eyes blazing. "Perhaps they will think I'm not a porcelain doll to be placed on a shelf and admired." Lady Wentworth's cheeks flushed. "You shame your sister with your behavior. Would it kill you to show some decorum? To think of the family for once." Margaret reached for Eleanor's hand beneath the table, her touch pleading. Eleanor pulled away, a storm brewing behind her eyes. "I will not apologize for being myself," she said quietly, rising from the table. After she left, Lady Wentworth turned to Margaret, her tone softening but no less insistent. "He must propose soon, my dear. You must give him every encouragement. Smile, laugh at his jokes, ask after his family." "A viscount does not come along every day." Margaret nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. For Edward, the days passed in a haze of doubt. He fulfilled his obligations dutifully, walking with Margaret, listening to her gentle observations, answering her shy questions. But his thoughts strayed more and more to Eleanor, her wild laughter, her fierce opinions, the way her eyes flashed when she spoke of things she loved. One afternoon, as he and Margaret strolled along the edge of the orchard, Edward felt the weight of his choice settle like a stone upon his chest. "Miss Margaret, may I ask, are you content here?" he ventured. She glanced up, startled by the question. "Of course, my lord. This is my home." He hesitated. "And if you were to leave it, to begin a new life elsewhere?" Margaret's gaze faltered. "I would do my duty, as I always have." Edward nodded, but the words rang hollow. He saw now how little he truly knew her and how much more he wished to know Eleanor. Later, he encountered Eleanor by chance near the stables, her skirts muddy, a stray lock of hair tumbling over her brow. "You look as if you have fought a dragon," he teased, attempting levity. She shot him a wry smile. "Only brambles. They have more teeth than most men." He laughed, genuine and unguarded. For a moment, they stood together in easy silence, the tension of society's gaze falling away. Eleanor spoke first, her voice low. "Do you ever tire of it, the endless pretending?" He looked at her, something raw flickering in his eyes. "Every day. But I fear the cost of honesty." She studied him, her own heart pounding. "What is the cost of living a lie?" Edward could not answer. The question hung between them, heavy with possibility and regret. That night, as the family sat in the drawing room, Lady Wentworth pressed Margaret's hand in Edward's, beaming with pride. The candlelight glinted off the family silver, illuminating Margaret's pale face and Edward's troubled gaze. Eleanor watched from the shadows, her emotions a tangled knot: envy, desire, despair. She knew what was expected of her: silence, obedience, a gracious smile. But every day, the mask grew harder to wear. Outside, a summer storm gathered, thunder rumbling on the horizon. Within the house, a different storm brewed, one of longing, doubt, and choices yet to be made. Edward looked at Margaret, at her gentle, expectant smile. Then his gaze slid to Eleanor, fierce and unyielding even in the dim light. He knew the world would never forgive him if he chose passion over propriety, truth over duty. But the pull between them, impossible to deny, impossible to accept, only grew stronger with each passing day. As the first drops of rain struck the window panes, Eleanor turned away, her heart aching with all she could not say. In the distance, the thunder rolled closer, a promise of upheaval still to come. The air inside Wentworth Manor shimmered with triumph. Sunlight poured through high windows, gilding the dust motes that danced over the drawing-room carpet. The Ashbury carriage stood proudly in the drive, its glossy black doors bearing the crest that had, for weeks, haunted Eleanor's every waking thought. The household maids, footmen, Lady Wentworth herself, seemed to move in time to a feverish, silent music of anticipation. Edward Ashbury stood before Margaret, one knee bent on the faded Persian rug. His voice was gentle, measured, each syllable resonant with expectation and the well-practiced solemnity of a man performing a sacred rite. Margaret, trembling, kept her eyes trained on her clasped hands. "Miss Margaret Wentworth," Edward said, "would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" Lady Wentworth's breath caught. The clock on the mantelpiece seemed to pause, as if the very house itself waited for Margaret's reply. Margaret looked up, her gaze flickering to her mother, then to Edward. For a heartbeat, her voice faltered. "Yes, my lord, I would be honored." A collective sigh swept the room. Lady Wentworth burst into tears, clutching Margaret to her breast. "Oh, my darling, my precious girl." The house seemed to exhale, the future secure at last. Eleanor watched from the threshold, her heart a wild animal caged behind her ribs. The applause, the laughter, the hurried plans for celebrations, all blurred into a distant roar. She clapped, too, because she must, but her hands felt numb. Edward's eyes met hers across the room just for a moment, a flicker of regret, of apology, perhaps. Or was it her own longing reflected back at her? The household erupted into activity. Invitations were discussed, menus debated, fabric samples summoned from the village. Margaret became the center of a whirlwind, her every movement shadowed by her mother's giddy anticipation. Yet in the quiet hours of the evening, when the corridors stilled and the world retreated behind drawn drapes, Margaret crept into Eleanor's room. She wore a simple nightgown, her hair undone, her cheeks blotched with the remains of weeping. Eleanor looked up from her place by the window. "Margaret?" Margaret hesitated, then crossed the room and knelt beside her sister. "Eleanor," she whispered, "do you think I will make him happy?" The words stunned Eleanor, slicing through her own ache. She wanted to lie, to offer easy comfort, but the sight of Margaret's uncertainty stilled her tongue. Margaret's voice shook. "He is kind. He is everything Mama ever wished for. But when he looks at me, I feel as if he's seeing someone else. Someone I ought to be, but am not." Eleanor gathered Margaret's hands in her own. "You are more than enough, Margaret. You are gentle and loyal and good. He could not wish for a better wife." Margaret's tears spilled over. "But what if he does? What if he wishes for someone braver or cleverer or—" her voice faltered, "or someone less afraid?" Eleanor squeezed her hand. "We all wish to be braver, but love grows in unexpected places. You must trust him and yourself." Margaret nodded, but her eyes remained shadowed. "Will you help me? Will you stand beside me?" Eleanor managed a smile, though her throat burned. "Always, dearest." That night, Eleanor lay awake listening to the house celebrate its triumph below. She pressed her hand to her chest as if she could quiet the storm within. She had promised to stand beside her sister. She would keep that promise, even if it meant denying her own heart. The following days passed in a blur of preparations. Lady Wentworth was relentless, her joy manifesting as a tyranny of lists and demands. "Margaret, try the lace with the pearl buttons. Eleanor, fetch the samples from Mrs. Firth. Margaret, remember to thank Lord Ashbury's aunt for her letter." "Eleanor, do sit up straight." Eleanor obeyed, but her patience frayed. She rode her horse recklessly over the moors, returned home mud-splattered and wind-blown, and spoke her mind with increasing boldness. She climbed trees to rescue a neighbor's cat, scandalized the vicar's wife by laughing too loudly in church, and, to her mother's horror, attended the village cricket match in trousers borrowed from a stable boy. Lady Wentworth confronted her in the morning room, voice trembling with fury. "You behave as though you wish to disgrace us all. Have you no thought for your sister's happiness?" Eleanor met her mother's gaze, eyes fierce. "I wish only for Margaret to be happy. I cannot pretend to be something I am not." Lady Wentworth's face softened, just for a moment. "You are too much like your father," she whispered, turning away. The household braced itself for the arrival of the Ashburys for a formal dinner. The evening was a spectacle. Margaret in pale blue silk, Edward in evening dress, Lady Wentworth fluttering like a nervous bird. Eleanor, in a gown several seasons old, stood apart, her posture proud, her eyes smoldering. After the meal, Eleanor escaped to the terrace, desperate for air. The garden glowed silver in the moonlight. She leaned against a stone balustrade, listening to the distant laughter inside. Footsteps crunched on the gravel behind her. She turned to see Edward, his expression taut. "Miss Eleanor," he said, voice low. "I wondered if I might speak with you." She bristled. "I'm sure Margaret awaits you. The future Lady Ashbury should not be left unattended." Edward's jaw tightened. "You need not be cruel." Eleanor whirled on him, her pain raw. "Is honesty cruelty, my lord, or simply inconvenient?" He stepped closer, the tension between them like a drawn bowstring. "Why do you persist in misunderstanding me?" She laughed bitterly. "I do not misunderstand. You have chosen, and I must accept it. I wish only to know why you look at me as if—" She stopped, breathless. Edward's face was shadowed with longing. "Do not ask questions you do not wish answered." "I wish for nothing," Eleanor lied, voice trembling. "Then why do you haunt my thoughts?" he demanded, his composure slipping. "Why do I search for you in every room?" She stepped back, voice breaking. "Because you are weak. Because you cannot bear to disappoint anyone, not even yourself." He reached for her arm, but she pulled away. "I have made a promise to Margaret," he said, his tone desperate. "I cannot break it. You must see that." Eleanor stared at him, tears burning her eyes. "I see only a man too afraid to live honestly. I pity you, my lord." Edward's hands fell to his sides, defeated. "You think me a coward." "I think you are human," she whispered, "and I wish I did not care." They stood in silence, the garden alive with moths and the scent of roses. The house behind them was full of light and laughter, but here in the shadows, everything was stripped bare. At last, Edward spoke. "I'm sorry for everything." Eleanor shook her head. "Sorry is nothing. Go back inside, my lord. Your bride awaits." He lingered, torn, then turned away, disappearing into the glow of the windows. Eleanor pressed her palms to the cold stone, struggling to steady her breath. The moon rode high above the fields, indifferent to the ache of human hearts. Inside, Margaret's laughter floated through the open doors, soft, uncertain, fragile as glass. Eleanor squared her shoulders and walked back inside, her resolve hardening like steel. She would stand beside her sister. She would not betray her own blood. But as she passed through the threshold, she knew that nothing would ever be simple again. The dance of duty and desire had only just begun, and the cost of silence was growing heavier with every heartbeat. In the hush before midnight, as the last candle guttered out, a secret decision began to take shape in Eleanor's heart, one that would change the fate of them all. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and relentless, sunlight pouring across the lawns of Wentworth Manor and into every corner of the house, illuminating the feverish preparations within. The halls thrummed with the hurried footsteps of servants, the clatter of breakfast trays, the sharp voices of dressmakers and florists. Lady Wentworth presided over it all with white-knuckled determination, her eyes bright with pride and anxiety. In Margaret's room, the scent of orange blossoms mingled with the perfume of pressed lace. Margaret sat before her mirror, her pale hands trembling in her lap, as the maid pinned the last sprigs of myrtle into her hair. Her reflection shimmered, ghostly and uncertain, beneath the weight of silk and expectation. Eleanor hovered at the doorway, her own dress a simple blue, her heart clenched tight. She watched her sister's face, searching for some sign of joy, but saw only the haunted vacancy of a bird trapped in a gilded cage. Margaret's breathing grew shallow. She twisted her fingers until the knuckles blanched. "Eleanor," she whispered, voice barely audible above the bustle. "I cannot do this." Eleanor crossed the room at once, kneeling beside her. "Margaret, you must breathe. It is only nerves. You are stronger than you know." Margaret shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "I am not. I cannot. Oh, Eleanor, they are all watching, all waiting. If I falter, they will never forgive me. And I—" Her breath hitched. "I do not love him. I wish I could, but I'm so afraid." Eleanor pulled her into a fierce embrace. "You do not have to do anything you do not wish. We can speak to Mama. Call it off." But Margaret's panic only mounted. She broke free, her face wild, and stumbled from the room, the sound of her sobs echoing down the corridor. The house was thrown into chaos. Lady Wentworth's voice rang out, shrill with panic. "Find her! She must not leave the grounds! Send for the maids! Search the gardens and the stables!" Eleanor darted through the house, calling her sister's name, but Margaret had vanished, as if swallowed by the earth itself. Outside, the wedding guests began to arrive, their carriages lining the drive, their laughter and gossip drifting through the open windows. In the withdrawing room, Lady Wentworth paced in circles, her composure crumbling with each passing minute. She rounded on Eleanor, eyes blazing. "This is your fault. You have filled her head with foolishness and doubts. If the truth is known, we are ruined. Do you understand?" Her voice dropped to a desperate whisper. "There is only one way. Only you can save us now." Eleanor stared at her mother in disbelief. "You cannot mean—" "You must take her place. The guests are here. The church is ready. The banns have been read. If you refuse, the scandal will destroy us all." Lady Wentworth seized Eleanor's hands, her grip bruising. "For the sake of your sister, your family, please." 1,000 refusals burned on Eleanor's tongue, but the sight of her mother's desperation, the knowledge of what a public disgrace would mean for Margaret, for them all, crushed her pride. She clenched her jaw, blinking back hot tears. "Very well," she said, her voice flat. "But do not expect me to smile." Servants rushed to fit Margaret's veil to Eleanor's head, to adjust the bodice and bustle, to wipe away the traces of tears and fury. Outside, the bells began to ring, calling the village to witness what none could imagine. Meanwhile, at the church, Edward stood in the vestry, adjusting his cuffs with nervous precision. He felt the weight of eyes upon him, the press of expectation as suffocating as the starched collar at his throat. His aunt murmured encouragements, the vicar rehearsed his lines, and Edward wondered, with a sick twist of dread, why Margaret's absence felt so ominous. A footman arrived, breathless, tugging at his sleeve. "My lord, there has been a change. Miss Margaret is indisposed. You are to marry Miss Eleanor in her place." The words struck Edward like a blow. "What?" he demanded, voice hoarse. "Where is Margaret? What has happened?" The servant could only shake his head. "It is not for me to say, my lord." Lady Wentworth's orders. Edward's mind reeled. He thought of Eleanor, her wildness, her honesty, her laughter in the woods. The thought of her walking down the aisle, forced into this farce, filled him with a dread he could not name. But the bells tolled, the pews were filled, and there was no time left for questions. Inside the church, the air was thick with anticipation. The villagers craned their necks, whispering behind gloved hands, as the organ thundered its opening chords. Lady Wentworth, regal and brittle, led Eleanor forward. The train of silk trailed behind her, the borrowed veil trembling as she walked. Eleanor's face was a mask of cold fury and humiliation, but her chin was lifted, her eyes fixed straight ahead. The stares of the congregation pressed against her like a storm. She could feel the weight of every rumor, every expectation, every unspoken accusation. Edward waited at the altar, pale and rigid. When Eleanor reached his side, their eyes met, a collision of pain, anger, and something deeper neither dared to name. The vicar cleared his throat, his hands trembling as he opened the prayer book. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here." The words faded into a blur as Eleanor gripped the bouquet, her knuckles white. She could hear the frantic beat of her own heart, the low murmur of scandal rippling through the crowd. Lady Wentworth sat ramrod straight in the front pew, her face a mask of triumph and terror. Edward's voice, when he spoke his vows, was steady but hollow. Eleanor's reply was little more than a whisper. each syllable carved from pride and sacrifice. The tension in the church was suffocating. Friends and strangers alike leaned forward, hungry for a misstep, for tears, for any sign that the Wentworths were not as invulnerable as they seemed. As the ceremony drew toward its climax, Eleanor glanced at Edward, saw in his eyes a reflection of her own fury and shame, but also a flicker of something else, raw and uncertain. Would either of them find the courage to speak their truth before it was too late? The question hung between them, heavier than the silence that filled the church. And as the vicar prepared to pronounce them man and wife, the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the storm to break. The words man and wife echoed through the ancient stone nave, reverberating in the uneasy silence that followed. The congregation, still stunned by the last-minute substitution, barely mustered a polite applause. Eleanor's bouquet trembled in her hands. Edward's arm felt like an iron bar beneath her fingers as they walked down the aisle together, faces stony and pale, the perfumed air thick with disbelief and speculation. The sun outside was blinding. As the new couple emerged onto the church steps, a sea of familiar faces parted to let them pass. Some guests averted their eyes in embarrassment. Others whispered behind lace fans and gloved hands. Lady Wentworth stood at the foot of the stairs, her expression brittle with triumph and terror, while Lord Ashbury's aunt glared daggers at Eleanor, her lips pressed in a thin, unforgiving line. A carriage awaited them, draped in white ribbons hastily rearranged for the substitute bride. Edward helped Eleanor inside with rigid formality. As soon as the door closed and the horses lurched forward, the fragile truce between them shattered. Eleanor was first to speak, her voice raw and shaking. "You should have refused." Edward stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. "And what would you have had me do? Leave your family to public ruin? Humiliate you further in front of the entire parish?" She laughed bitterly. "You think this is not humiliation enough?" Forced to the altar like a sacrificial lamb. "Neither of us had a choice," he snapped, anger flickering in his eyes. "You know as well as I that your mother would have seen the whole world burn to save her name." Eleanor turned from him, pressing her forehead to the cool glass. The village slipped by, a blur of stone cottages and gawking faces. "You could have spoken. You could have given us both a chance to say no, and condemn us both." Edward's tone softened, haunted. "You saw the church. They would have devoured you." She closed her eyes, the words cutting deep. "They will devour me anyway. And you, do you not hear what they are already saying?" He let out a shuddering breath. "I hear it. I have always heard it. Duty, honor, reputation. What do those mean, when all I feel is shame?" The carriage rattled over a rut, and silence fell between them, thick and suffocating. When they reached Ashbury House, the butler received them with the strained dignity of a man accustomed to disaster. The staff lined the entrance, eyes carefully blank, but Eleanor saw the curiosity and judgment simmering beneath the surface. Inside, the grand hall had been decorated for a celebration that no one could now stomach. White roses and garlands drooped in the heat, wilting as quickly as the smiles of the guests who trickled in for the subdued wedding breakfast. The air vibrated with awkward conversation and stilted toasts. Eleanor, seated at the head table beside Edward, kept her chin high and her expression unreadable. She endured the congratulatory handshakes and veiled barbs, her mind drifting to Margaret wherever she was, free from this nightmare, or perhaps lost in some other misery. Lady Wentworth hovered at her side, fussing with Eleanor's veil and whispering, "Smile, for heaven's sake. All will be well, if only you behave." Eleanor bit back her retort. She had no intention of playing the grateful bride. She refused to offer the gossips the satisfaction of seeing her weep or cower. Edward, for his part, spoke little, responding to inquiries with practiced civility. His eyes rarely met Eleanor's, and when they did, they flashed with a mixture of resentment and something softer regret, perhaps, or longing for a life that was no longer possible. He drank more wine than was wise, his hand tightening on the stem of his glass each time someone remarked on the unexpected turn of the day. After the guests departed, Eleanor wandered through the unfamiliar corridors of Ashbury House, trailed by the whispers of servants and the shadows of her own doubts. The rooms, though grand, felt cold and inhospitable. She found herself longing for the wild woods and open moors of her childhood, for the comfort of Margaret's gentle presence, even for her mother's familiar admonishments. Edward confronted her in the blue drawing room, the door clicking shut behind him. "You are to have the West Chambers," he said stiffly. "As tradition dictates, if you wish for anything else, you need only instruct the housekeeper." Eleanor turned, her eyes blazing. "Do not speak to me as if I am a guest in your house." He bristled. "What would you have me say, Eleanor? You have made it clear you want nothing from me." She advanced on him, voice trembling with fury. "What I want is not to be a pawn in your family's game. I will not let you or anyone else dictate my every movement. If you expect a silent, obedient wife, you will be disappointed." He stared at her, color rising in his cheeks. "And what do you expect, Eleanor? That we parade our misery before the world? That I renounce my name, my duty, for your pride?" She laughed, harsh and wild. "Your name, your duty, those are all you have. Is that not so? You would rather be pitied than free. Do not presume to know my heart," he said, voice low and dangerous. "You know nothing of what I have sacrificed." Eleanor's breath caught. For a moment, the mask slipped, and she saw the man beneath the one who had once listened to her secrets in the woods, who had longed for more than duty and decorum. But then he turned away, shoulders rigid. "I will not live in a cage," she said, softer now. "If I am to be your wife, it will be on my own terms." He regarded her over his shoulder. "Then you will find the bars are stronger than you imagine." They parted with no resolution, the gulf between them wider than ever. The following days were a waking nightmare. The village seethed with rumor and speculation. Some claimed Eleanor had schemed for this outcome all along. Others whispered that Margaret's collapse was divine punishment for the family's pride. Invitations to tea were withdrawn. The vicar's wife called only to extract the juiciest details. In the market, shopkeepers greeted Eleanor with chilly politeness, and children stared as if she were a creature from a cautionary tale. At Ashbury House, the servants kept their distance, gossiping in corners. Lady Wentworth wrote daily, her letters alternating between frantic reassurance and veiled threats. Eleanor responded to none of them. She spent her days riding the estate's boundaries, refusing to heed the housekeeper's advice or the disapproving glances of Edward's relatives. She dined with Edward each evening, the table between them as wide as the ocean. Conversation was minimal, their exchanges brittle and sharp. One night, after a particularly tense supper, Edward broke the silence. "You are making a spectacle of yourself. The villagers will never accept you if you continue as you are." Eleanor set down her fork, her eyes cold. "I do not seek their approval." "Nor yours." He exhaled, frustration etched in every line of his face. "There are rules, Eleanor, traditions. If you trample on them, you will only hurt yourself." "Better to be wounded for honesty than suffocated by lies," she retorted. "I will not be made small to fit your world." His voice was quiet but strained. "And what of us? Is there nothing left to build?" She hesitated, her defenses wavering. "I do not know. Not while we are both prisoners." He looked away, defeat plain in his posture. "Perhaps that is all we shall ever be." The days stretched into weeks, marked by isolation and the slow, corrosive work of scandal. Eleanor grew accustomed to the chill in the drawing room, the silence in the halls, the wary eyes of those who watched and waited for her to fail. Yet beneath the anger and humiliation, something else stirred, a stubborn hope, or perhaps merely defiance. She would not let them break her. She would not surrender the last vestiges of herself, even as the world closed in. Edward, too, was changed. His composure grew brittle, his temper quick to flare. He rode out alone, spent long hours in his study, avoided both Eleanor and the expectations of his kin. He was a man divided, caught between the chains of propriety and the dangerous allure of freedom. On a rain-swept afternoon, as thunder rattled the window panes, Eleanor stood at the library window, watching the storm roll over the fields. Edward entered, soaked and breathless, as if pursued by demons. They stared at each other, two strangers bound by accident and sacrifice, pride and pain. "Will you fight me forever?" Edward asked, voice raw. "Only until I remember who I am," Eleanor replied, her gaze unyielding. He nodded, a grim smile flickering across his lips. Then perhaps there is hope for us yet. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, the tension between them shimmered, unresolved, electric, alive with the promise of battles yet to be fought, and truths still waiting to be spoken. Dawn broke over Ashbury House, its golden light revealing a home divided by silence. In the weeks following the wedding, every corridor, every drawing room seemed to echo with the unspoken hostilities of two wounded hearts. Eleanor moved through the grand halls as if through a foreign land, her chin high, her eyes defiant. The staff watched her with wary curiosity, waiting to see if the new Lady Ashbury would bend or break beneath the weight of tradition. She did neither. On her first morning, Eleanor appeared in the breakfast room in a simple walking dress, her hair loose about her shoulders. She poured her own tea, refusing the footman's nervous offer, and read the Times aloud to herself, ignoring the sidelong glances of the housekeeper and the butler. Edward entered a quarter hour later, perfectly turned out, his face a mask of polite indifference. He greeted her stiffly, took his place at the opposite end of the long table, and opened his correspondence with more noise than was strictly necessary. They ate in silence, broken only by the occasional clatter of cutlery. Afterward, Edward retreated to his study, burying himself in estate ledgers, correspondence, and the affairs of tenants. Eleanor, left to her own devices, wandered the house, her curiosity undimmed by disapproval. She found solace in the library, a vast chamber lined with books from floor to ceiling. There she lost herself in the pages of Shelley, Austen, and the poets who spoke to her restless soul. The servants soon learned to leave her undisturbed, and a quiet admiration grew among them for her courage and her refusal to cower before the new order. Mrs. Greaves, the housekeeper, was the first to show open kindness. One afternoon, finding Eleanor perched atop a ladder, reaching for a volume on Greek philosophy, she bustled in with a tray of tea and cakes. "You'll twist your ankle, my lady, climbing like that," Mrs. Greaves scolded, but her tone was warm. "Let me fetch the step for you." Eleanor smiled, accepting the tea. "Thank you, Mrs. Greaves. I have never cared much for waiting to be waited upon." The older woman pursed her lips, but there was a gleam of approval in her eye. "The last Lady Ashbury never came in here at all. She said the dust was bad for her lungs." Eleanor laughed softly. Then she missed the best room in the house. The staff's opinion of her began to shift. The cook, Mrs. Blanchard, started slipping Eleanor little treats, ginger biscuits, slices of seed cake left discreetly on a tray by the library door. The gardener, old Mr. Webb, showed her the secret roses behind the west wall, proud to find in her a listener who cared for the ancient trees and the wild corners of the estate. But with Edward, there was only coldness. He kept himself barricaded behind ledgers and obligations, his pride wounded and his affections shrouded in confusion. He resented Eleanor's independence, her laughter with the staff, the way she ignored the rules that had governed his world since childhood. One evening, as they dined together, the tension was nearly unbearable. Eleanor picked at her food, her mind wandering to the book she'd left open in the library. Edward broke the silence, his voice clipped. "The villagers expect you to attend the harvest supper next week. As Lady Ashbury, it is your duty to receive them." Eleanor set down her fork, meeting his gaze squarely. "If I am to receive them, I will do so on my terms. I will not simper and smile for people who think me an interloper." He bristled. "They will never accept you if you continue as you are." "I do not require their acceptance," she replied, her tone even but firm. "Nor yours." Edward's lips thinned. "You are determined to make enemies wherever you go." She shrugged. "I would rather be disliked for honesty than adored for pretense." He looked away, pain flickering across his features. "You know nothing of what is required to keep this house, this family, intact." "I know what it is to sacrifice oneself for duty," she said quietly, "but I will not be erased." After dinner, Edward retreated to the billiard room. He stared at the green baize table, the cue trembling in his hand, his thoughts a tangled snarl of duty and desire. He remembered the Eleanor of the woods, her laughter like summer thunder, her eyes alight with mischief and longing. He had wanted her, he still did, though he would never admit it, not even to himself. Eleanor, for her part, sought comfort in the company of those who understood her least and judged her not at all. She read aloud to the maids as they mended linens in the laundry, shared stories with the kitchen boys in the garden, and listened to Mrs. Greaves' tales of old Ashbury scandals by the warmth of the kitchen hearth. Gradually, she became a figure of fascination below stairs. The staff admired her courage, her refusal to let the bitterness of her marriage sour her spirit. They whispered that she was not like the other ladies, that she might one day make Ashbury House a home again. Still, the gulf between husband and wife yawned wide. One rain-lashed afternoon, Eleanor wandered into the stables, her skirts muddy, hair escaping its pins. She found Edward there, brooding over a lame gelding. The air was thick with the scent of hay and horse, the silence charged. She watched him for a moment before speaking. "You care for your horses better than your wife, my lord." He looked up, startled by her boldness. "The horses do not argue with me at every turn." She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Perhaps if you listened, you would find I am not always at odds with you." He set down the brush, his jaw working. "You are impossible." "Only because you want me to be someone I am not." He hesitated, then said softer than before, "You are not what I expected." Eleanor's gaze softened, but she held her ground. "Nor are you, but perhaps that is not such a terrible thing." They stood in the dim stable, the rain drumming on the roof, the distance between them as fragile as spun glass. That night, as Eleanor sat by her bedroom window, she watched the storm rage across the fields. She felt something shift within her, a stubborn hope, a belief that perhaps, with time, the ice between them might crack. She thought of Edward, alone in his study, and wondered if he too felt the weight of their loneliness. Edward lay awake, staring at the ceiling, haunted by Eleanor's words and the memory of her laughter. He admired her spirit, her refusal to be cowed, though it confounded him. He wondered if he could ever be enough for such a woman, or if the ghosts of duty and pride would always stand between them. The next morning, Eleanor rose early and rode out before breakfast, her hair unbound to the wind. When she returned, Mrs. Greaves greeted her with a conspiratorial wink and a plate of warm scones. In that moment, Eleanor realized she had found a kind of kinship in the unlikeliest of places. The house was still cold, the silences long, but something had begun to change. Edward, watching from the window as Eleanor laughed with the gardener, felt the first stirrings of admiration outweigh his resentment. Neither spoke of it, neither dared. The old wounds were too fresh, the fear of rejection too great. Yet the spark of something new, something fragile and fierce, flickered in the spaces between their anger. And as summer faded into autumn, Eleanor and Edward remained adversaries, yet also reluctant companions in their solitude, each secretly wondering if there might be more to their union than disappointment and regret. A heavy fog blanketed Ashbury House, muffling the anxious voices that drifted through the corridors. In the study, Edward sat slumped over a stack of ledgers, the candlelight throwing harsh shadows across his troubled face. The silence was broken only by the relentless ticking of the clock and the scratch of his pen as he tried again and again to make the sums reconcile, to conjure a miracle from dwindling accounts. Eleanor stood in the doorway, arms folded, watching him struggle. For days now, rumors had swirled through the house and village. Creditors visiting in the night, bills left unpaid, tenants complaining of repairs left undone. Eleanor had seen the worry etched deep into the butler's brow, the housekeeper's whispered conferences behind closed doors. Yet Edward, proud and solitary, had tried to shield her from the storm. She would not be shielded. Not anymore. "You cannot keep doing this alone," she said quietly, stepping into the room. Edward looked up, startled by her presence. "This is not your concern." "It is my concern," she replied, her voice firm. "I am Lady Ashbury, whether you like it or not. And this is my home, too." He hesitated, torn between pride and desperation. "There are matters you would not understand." "Then explain them to me," Eleanor pressed. "Let me help." He stared at her, measuring her resolve, then gestured to the ledgers. "The estate is bleeding. Rents are down, the harvest failed. My father left debts I never knew. The creditors are threatening to call in their loans. If they do, Ashbury will be lost. Eleanor absorbed the news in silence. At last she pulled a chair beside him, scanning the columns of figures with swift, clear eyes. Have you considered selling some of the unused land, or opening the West Meadow for grazing to tenants at a lower rate? Edward frowned. The West Meadow is not arable. It is perfect for sheep, she countered. And the wool market is strong this year. If you lease the grazing rights, you can secure quick income and mend relations with the tenants. He watched her, surprised by the insight. You are suggesting I break with tradition. I'm suggesting you survive, she retorted. Tradition will not pay the butcher. Edward fell silent, considering. Eleanor leaned forward, her mind whirring. What about the old mill? She continued. It sits idle. We could offer it to the villagers as a cooperative, let them run it for a share of the profits. They would have incentive to keep it productive, and you would no longer bear the cost of repairs alone. Edward blinked, a slow smile dawning. You have a head for this. I have a head for survival, Eleanor replied, a hint of pride in her tone. My father taught me to read accounts. He used to say, a country house is built on cleverness, not luck. They spent hours hunched over the figures, Eleanor proposing, Edward debating, the two of them arguing and laughing and discovering, for the first time, the pleasure of working side by side. When the creditors arrived, grim and expectant, Eleanor greeted them in the drawing room, her posture regal, her eyes unflinching. My lord is prepared to honor every debt, she declared, but you must be patient. The estate will pay in full, with interest, if given time. The eldest creditor, a beady-eyed man named Mr. Trent sneered. Fine words, madam, but we have heard them before. Eleanor met his gaze without blinking. This time, you have my word, and my word is not so easily broken as others. Edward stood beside her, shoulders squared. Lady Ashbury speaks for us both. Give us until the autumn, and you will have your money. The creditors, cowed by the united front, grumbled but agreed. Outside, as the carriages rattled away, Edward turned to Eleanor, awe and gratitude warring in his eyes. You were remarkable, he said softly. I have never seen Trent so easily handled. Eleanor smiled, her cheeks flushed from victory. I have faced worse than a few creditors. He laughed, the sound rich and unfamiliar. I am beginning to believe you have. The days that followed were a flurry of action. Eleanor met with tenants, negotiated with merchants, and oversaw the reopening of the mill. She rode across the fields with the steward, boots muddied and hair tousled, never caring for the whispers of propriety. She drew up contracts in the library, her pen swift and sure, while Edward watched in wonder as the household fell into step behind her. The staff, once wary, now sought her advice. The villagers, suspicious at first, warmed to her as she listened to their grievances and delivered on her promises. Even the most critical of the local gentry could not ignore the transformation. Ashbury's fortunes slowly improved. The estate bustled with new life, and the shadow of ruin receded. Through it all, Edward found himself drawn to Eleanor in ways he had never anticipated. He admired her intellect, her humor, the fierce way she defended those under her care. He began to see her not as an adversary, but as an equal, someone who had stood with him in the darkest hour and refused to let him fall. One evening, after the last account had been tallied and the final letter sent, Edward joined Eleanor on the terrace, the air warm and fragrant with late summer roses. You have saved Ashbury, he said, his voice full of quiet wonder. She shook her head, smiling. We saved it together. He hesitated, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. I have been a fool, Eleanor. I let pride and fear blind me to what was right in front of me. She looked at him, her heart quickening. And what do you see now? He stepped closer, his voice low. I see a woman braver and wiser than I ever imagined. I see my wife not by accident, but by choice. Eleanor's breath caught. You never courted me, Edward. Not truly. He reached for her hand, his touch tentative. Then let me begin now. He led her into the garden where fireflies hovered in the dusk. They walked together beneath the ancient oaks, talking softly, laughter mingling with the evening breeze. Edward listened as Eleanor described her dreams for the estate, her vision for a future built on trust and partnership. He shared his own hopes and fears, his regrets and desires, bearing his heart in a way he never had before. The distance between them, once so vast, now felt as thin as mist. In the days that followed, Edward's attentions grew gentle and sincere. He sent her wildflowers gathered from the meadow, invited her to ride beside him at dawn, brought her books he thought she might enjoy. He listened, truly listened to her counsel, and defended her against any who questioned her place at Ashbury. The staff began to whisper anew, this time with approval. The villagers watched with growing respect as Lord and Lady Ashbury faced each challenge together, their partnership undeniable. One afternoon, as they strolled through the orchard, Eleanor glanced at Edward, her lips curving in a wry smile. "You are not as difficult as I first believed," he chuckled. "Nor are you as impossible as I feared." They stopped beneath a laden apple tree, the sun dappling their faces. Edward reached out, brushing a strand of hair from Eleanor's cheek. "I do not know what the future holds," he murmured, "but I know I wish to face it with you." Eleanor's heart fluttered, hope and longing mingling at last. "Then let us meet it together, Edward, whatever may come." As the wind stirred the branches above, they stood in the golden light, their hands entwined. The old enmity between them burned away by newfound trust and undeniable desire. But even as their partnership blossomed, the world beyond Ashbury still watched, waiting for them to falter. And in the shadows, old secrets and rivalries lingered, threatening to test the fragile peace they had built together. The orchard was in bloom, white petals drifting like snow on the spring air. Eleanor walked arm in arm with Edward, laughter rising between them, the wounds of the past months finally softening into something gentle and bright. He brushed a loose strand of hair from her face, his eyes warm, and for the first time since their wedding day, Eleanor felt herself truly cherished. Their days unfolded with a new, unexpected ease. Edward's courtship tender, attentive brought out a playful side in Eleanor that had long been buried beneath duty and pride. They rode together at dawn, debated over books in the library, and spent long evenings by the fire, sharing dreams once too fragile to voice. It seemed, at last, that happiness had found them. But peace in Ashbury was always precarious, and the world beyond their gates had not forgotten. One afternoon, as Eleanor oversaw repairs in the village school, a commotion erupted at the manor. A carriage, its livery unmistakable, rolled up the drive. Lady Wentworth emerged first, her face pinched with worry, followed by Margaret, paler, thinner, but standing tall with an air of newfound resolve. The sight of her sister, so long absent, sent a jolt of dread through Eleanor's heart. By the time Eleanor reached the drawing room, Lady Wentworth had already seized control. "We must discuss the future of this family," she declared, voice sharp as ever. "Margaret has returned to us, and you must both do your duty." Margaret met Eleanor's gaze, her blue eyes steady. "I wish to speak to Eleanor alone." Lady Wentworth hesitated, but seeing the determination in her younger daughter's face, swept from the room with a final pointed look at Eleanor. For a moment, the sisters stood in silence, the gulf between them heavy with everything unspoken. Margaret was the first to break it. "You look well, Eleanor, happier than I have ever seen you." Eleanor's throat tightened. "I'm happier than I ever believed possible." "Margaret, I never wished to hurt you." Margaret's lips quivered, but she held her composure. "I know. For a long time I thought I could not forgive you or Edward, but I have had months to think, to recover my strength. I'm not the girl who ran from the altar. I will not be swept aside or pitied." Eleanor reached for her sister's hand, but Margaret drew back. "I want a place here, Eleanor. I want to be part of this family again. But society whispers that your marriage is a stain on us all. There are those who urge me to pursue an annulment for the sake of our reputations." Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest. "Would you do that? Margaret, please." Margaret's eyes flashed. "I do not wish to hurt you, but I will not disappear. I have a right to happiness too. If you truly love Edward, you must fight for him, for yourself. I will not do it for you." The words struck Eleanor like a blow. She felt her certainty waver, for beneath Margaret's resolve was a deep ache she recognized as her own. As the day wore on, rumors began to swirl. The villagers, never shy of gossip, whispered that Margaret's return meant the marriage would soon be undone. The local vicar, emboldened by the scandal, called at the house to offer counsel. Even Edward's relatives began to speak of legal remedies, urging him to consider what was best for the Ashbury name. Edward was tormented, pulled in every direction. He retreated to his study, pacing before the window, while Eleanor stood on the threshold, unable to cross into the storm of his doubts. At supper, Lady Wentworth pressed her advantage. "Edward, you know as well as I that an annulment is the only solution. Margaret's honor must be restored. Eleanor will find another match, and all will be forgotten in time." Eleanor's hands clenched in her lap. "I will not be bartered, mother. I am Edward's wife by law and by choice." Lady Wentworth's eyes narrowed. "Choice. You were forced, and everyone knows it. Your happiness cannot come at the expense of your sister's future." Edward looked from one woman to the other, his jaw tense. "Enough. I will not make a decision while tempers run so high." He left the room, the door slamming behind him. That night, Eleanor lay awake, fear gnawing at her resolve for the first time. What if Edward chose duty over love? What if all she had fought for was about to slip through her fingers? The prospect of losing him, of returning to the cold, silent life she had once endured, was more than she could bear. Unable to sleep, she found Margaret in the old nursery, staring out at the moonlit gardens. "Why have you come back?" Eleanor whispered. "Is it only for the family's name?" Margaret turned, her voice trembling. "No, I came because I cannot bear to be the reason you are unhappy. But I'm so tired of being the weak one, the one everyone pities. I want to be strong like you. I want to choose my own path." Eleanor stepped closer, her eyes filling with tears. "You are stronger than you know. I have envied your gentleness all my life." Margaret shook her head. "You are brave. I have always admired that, but now it is your turn to fight for what you want. If you love him, do not let mother or society tear you apart. You must stand together, or all this suffering will have meant nothing." The sisters embraced, the past slipping away between their tears. When Eleanor left, her heart was steadier, though the storm outside raged on. The following days were a crucible. Lady Wentworth campaigned with renewed vigor, summoning lawyers and family friends, each visit another blow to Eleanor's composure. Edward, caught between worlds, seemed ever more distant, until one evening he sought Eleanor in the library. She looked up from her book, her expression wary. He hesitated, then crossed the room, taking her hand in his. "I have been a coward," he said softly, "but I am done letting others decide for me. I love you, Eleanor. I choose you." Relief and joy flooded her, but fear lingered. "Edward, what if they force you? What if the world turns its back on us?" He pulled her into his arms. "Let the world say what it will. You are my wife, and I will not lose you." Eleanor closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe in their happiness, however fragile. But outside the library doors, Lady Wentworth conferred with Margaret, her voice sharp with warning. The battle for Ashbury and for love was far from over, and as the spring winds rattled the windows, Eleanor knew the true test was still to come. The ballroom of Ashbury House shimmered with candlelight, its gilded mirrors reflecting 100 faces caught between hope and censure. Society's finest had gathered, lured by the promise of scandal and spectacle, a promise Eleanor could feel humming in the air, sharp as the snap of a fan. The string quartet played, but the music was only a thin veil over the tension that coiled in every glance, every whispered aside. Eleanor stood at the edge of the crowd, her heart pounding beneath her silk bodice. She wore no jewels but her own resolve. Edward's hand found hers, steady and warm, and she looked up to find him watching her with a quiet fierceness. "They are waiting for a show," she murmured, her voice low. Edward squeezed her fingers. Then let us give them one they will never forget. He stepped forward, drawing the attention of every guest as he mounted the small dais at the head of the room. A hush fell, rippling outward until only the faintest strains of music remained. Edward's eyes swept the assembled crowd, pausing on the hard faces of his relatives, the icy disdain of Lady Ashbury's old friends, and the anxious hope in Lady Wentworth's gaze. He spoke without hesitation, his voice ringing clear. Friends, neighbors, and honored guests, there has been much talk, too much, about my marriage, my family, and the choices we have made. Tonight, I put an end to rumor and speculation. I have chosen my wife, and I stand by her, not for duty, nor for convenience, but for love. A collective gasp fluttered through the room. Edward's gaze did not falter. Eleanor is my partner in all things. She has saved this house, this land, and, I dare say, my heart. If there are those among you who cannot accept this, then I bid you good evening and good riddance. Ashbury will not close its doors to love, nor will it bow to those who value gossip above truth. He stepped down and offered his arm to Eleanor. For a moment, the room was utterly silent. Then, as if a spell had been broken, a handful of guests began to applaud, tentative at first, then bolder. The rest, faced with Edward's unyielding resolve, fell silent or slipped away, their power broken. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them away, holding her head high. Edward's declaration echoed in her ears, a promise made before the world. Later, as the crowd thinned, Margaret appeared in the corridor outside the ballroom. She was no longer the fragile girl who had once fled the altar, but a young woman with her own quiet dignity. She found Eleanor by a window, looking out at the moonlit gardens. I heard him, Margaret said softly. He loves you. Eleanor turned, searching her sister's face for any sign of anger or regret. Margaret, I never meant for this. Margaret shook her head, a gentle smile curving her lips. You do not need to explain. I stayed too long in the shadow of others' wishes. It is time I find my own path. Eleanor stepped forward, tears threatening again. Where will you go? Margaret glanced toward the darkness beyond the glass. To London, perhaps, or Bath. There is a world waiting for me, Eleanor. I mean to discover it. They embraced, the pain of the past months melting away into something softer, more hopeful. Write to me, Eleanor whispered. I will, Margaret promised, and I hope one day you will be proud of me. As Margaret departed, Lady Wentworth appeared, her face lined with worry and love. She hesitated, the years of pride and disappointment weighing heavy on her shoulders. Mother, Eleanor said quietly, there is no shame in changing. Lady Wentworth's eyes filled with tears. I have made many mistakes. Will you forgive me? Eleanor reached for her mother's hand. We all must learn to forgive and to begin again. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere in Ashbury shifted. The scandal, so carefully nurtured by the gossips, began to lose its sting as Edward and Eleanor stood united. Lady Wentworth, humbled by her daughter's choices, worked to mend the rifts she had helped create. She wrote to Margaret every week, urging her to visit, and even welcomed Eleanor's unconventional ideas for the estate. The villagers, once wary, grew to respect the new Lady Ashbury. Eleanor's courage and kindness became legend. She and Edward worked side by side, their partnership a model for all who had doubted them. In every decision, in every challenge, they stood together, no longer divided by fear or the ghosts of the past. One golden afternoon, as the estate bustled with the noise of harvest, Edward found Eleanor in the orchard, laughter ringing as she helped the children gather apples. He drew her close, pressing a kiss to her brow. Are you happy, my love? He asked. Eleanor smiled up at him, her heart full. For the first time, I'm not afraid of happiness. He took her hand, and together they walked toward the house, their future unburdened by shame, united by the love they had fought so hard to claim. And as autumn ripened around them, Eleanor knew that their peace was not the absence of struggle, but the hard-won triumph of two souls who had chosen each other freely, fiercely, and forever.